Hello, welcome everyone. Before we forget, next week, with the help of Hashem, we will not be meeting in our regular program. Next week, a week from today, Thursday, the 17th of Tammuz, is a big holiday. It's a big festival. And if, God forbid, Moshiach is delayed until then it's a fast day and it's a sad day. But either way, we're not going to be meeting, hopefully in a good way. Otherwise, it's a fast day. And being that we're in the longest days of the year, so the fast doesn't end until about 9 p.m. Chicago time. And only Jews need to fast. Noachites don't have to fast, but I will not be up to giving a class. Anyway, if you recall, last class, the last few minutes or so, we mentioned something, which I guess you could say pretty incredible. And I said we're going to have to backtrack a little bit. And here we are. So we're continuing this Sicha, this talk, this essay of the Rebbe Melech HaMoshiach in Likutei Sichois, volume 26, and it's the third Sicha on the Torah portion of Yisro Jethro, and we are on page 138. All right, we're talking over here about a Ger Toshav, and we've discussed Ger Toshav many times. Basically, the point that is being made here in this particular Sicha, in this talk, is that just because, according to Maimonides, according to the Rambam, we cannot accept a Ger Toshav nowadays, when we don't have the Jubilee year in effect, that by no means diminishes the obligation, the responsibility, and the opportunity for all of mankind to become Noachites, and therefore for the Jewish people to teach them, educate them, encourage them, or to use the Rambam's language, if you want to be a little bit reserved and this, it would be to compel. Otherwise, if you want to be more literal or direct, to force the Noachites to keep their 7 commandments. Just because you don't have a Ger Toshav doesn't mean that there's any room to be lax or lenient. It's still definitely applicable. And we're getting into the difference, exactly what is a Ger Toshav. And so we said that there's 2 opinions, whether he needs to formally accept in front of the Jewish tribunal, the Jewish Beis Din, the court, not to serve Avodah Zarah, idolatry, or all 7 commandments. And we said that the law remains that he has to accept all 7. Be that as it may, we find in the early commentaries, which would be Maimonides' contemporaries, people on that level, which in the rabbinic literature, being that we have to break up the various different eras, so that era is called the time of the Rishonim, which literally means the first ones. But it's kind of confusing and misleading because they're not the first ones. They're only the first ones relative to the next generation, the next era, which are the last ones. So it's after the Tanoic, Mishnaic era, and after the Amorayic, Talmudic era, and then there's another short era, and then there's another era, and then comes the Rishonim, the first ones. So basically, time-wise, we're talking about 1,000 years ago was the beginning of this era, and it lasted for roughly 500 years. So it's a relatively long span of time. Not every Rishonim sat around the same table or wrote letters to each other. The ones that were in France, or the ones that were in Spain, or in Germany, or wherever they were, they didn't all necessarily live in the exact same time. All right. So Rabbeinu Gershom, which we deviated and spoke a little bit about him last time. So if you have the recording, or if you want to go see last week's class, you're welcome to do so. I will not repeat everything that we said about Rabbeinu Gershom, as fascinating as it may have been. Rabbeinu Gershom, which is from the very first, he's from the early Rishonim. In his commentary to the Talmud, he uses the expression that a person who goes and becomes a ger toshav is ksas gerus, which means a little bit of conversion. In other words, with regards to the 7 Noachide commandments. Or, as it brings down in the footnote 50, another one of the Rishonim, the Meiri, in his commentary to another place in the Talmud, actually uses another term, which is more or less the same, but in a certain sense, it's even more extreme. Ger lachatzoyin, half a convert. Now, I very emphatically always mention, and last time I said this as well, and this part I will reiterate. Normally, when you ask myself or anybody like me, can a person be half Jewish or quarter Jewish? And oftentimes, when doing outreach and meeting a person, and I need to know whether they're Jewish or not, because I know I need to know what approach to take. Am I supposed to influence them to keep the 613? When I say 613, I obviously don't mean all the commandments we can't do nowadays, but that's the term we use. In other words, do I have to get them to do the commandments for the Jew, or do I need to try to convince them to keep the 7? I got to know. It's imperative to know whether the person I'm dealing with is Jewish or not. So I ask the person, are you Jewish? And sometimes the answer is half or a quarter. And immediately, almost instinctively, the response of your good, average Lubavitcher, Chabadnik would be, no such thing. You're either 100% totally Jewish or 100% totally not Jewish. No chayd. All right? We're not dealing over here with the genetics and in your blood. We're talking about by Jewish law, and therefore, do you have a neshama, a soul, a Jewish soul? If your mother, your birth mother, that is or was Jewish, and what made her Jewish is because her birth, biological mother, was Jewish, and so on, then you are 100% Jewish, no matter what your father is, or if your maternal grandmother, your mother's mother was Jewish. It doesn't matter that the other 3 grandparents were as non-Jewish as can be. You're Jewish 100%, not 25%, not 50%, not 2%, not 98%. No such thing. You're Jewish. However, if, or the other option is if the person is a ger, if they converted halachically, according to the code of Jewish law, and it's very, very important to emphasize. If the person correctly converted by Jewish law, then they're 100% Jewish, as if they were born Jewish. However, if 3 out of 4 of your grandparents are halachically, are Jewish by Jewish law, it just happens to be that your mom's mom is not Jewish, then you are 100% not Jewish. You're not a little bit Jewish. You may have Jewish blood. That's a biological, that's a physical, scientific fact. That's that's a clinical issue. That's not anything to do with the law. So your husband is Jewish, your father is Jewish, both his parents are Jewish, and your mother's father is Jewish, and all your neighbors are Jewish, and your mother's mother is not. You are 100% not Jewish. Okay, that would be the typical approach. However, this seemingly deflates that approach because there is a concept, it really doesn't, but seemingly, there is a concept of a ger toshav. And a ger toshav is either ktsas gerus, a little bit of a conversion, or ger lachatzoin, half a convert. Truth is, when we do have a ger toshav, by Jewish law, the ger toshav actually, at least according to many opinions, has gone out of the category of being a goy, of being a non-Jew, of being a typical Noachite. And has, obviously they're not Jewish, but they have partially become somewhat Jewish, if you will. They're no longer part of the 70 nations. So it's a very interesting, a very unique status. In other words, if you want to be legally accurate, you cannot call that person a non-Jew. You cannot call them, better yet, a goy, which is a term for someone who's not Jewish. And it's not even good enough to call them a Noachite, a ben Noach, or her. You can surely not call them Jewish. You can't call them a Jew. So what are they? They are a ger toshav, which is a separate category. And amongst all the various different things that he brings down in footnote 50, let me just share one of a whole bunch. In the Jewish Code of Law, in the section where it speaks about ritual slaughtering, so it says as follows. According to the Rambam, Maimonides, which others don't agree. So according to the Rambam, as opposed to other contemporaries of his, if a ger, now the law is that in order for it to be a kosher slaughtering, it must be slaughtered by a Jew. Okay? A non-Jew that's slaughtered, a Jew can't eat from it. It's called nevela. It's not kosher meat. Even though the knife was perfect and it was just examined by the greatest experts, by the rabbi, by the shoichet, the one who slaughters, they check the knife right before and right after, and they're standing over him and they're watching him do it. If the physical act of slaughtering was done by a non-Jew, that shechita, that shechting, that slaughtering is unacceptable. However, according to the Rambam, the way it's explained by one of the main codifiers in the Jewish Code of Law, the Taz, according to Maimonides, if a ger toshav slaughters the animal, it's only not kosher for the Jew rabbinically. They made a decree. But biblically, it would be kosher. Not everyone agrees with that. But according to the way that this codifier explains the Rambam's approach, a ger toshav who slaughters an animal, biblically that would be kosher for a Jew to eat. Just everyone agrees that it's not. The question is it biblically not good, or is it only because the rabbis made a decree? So a ger toshav is really not just a really good person who's keeping the 7 Noachide commandments. He really does come into a whole different category, especially if you're going to take these words that the way they're using it. And again, these are from the greatest. They don't, just mess around with words. every word that they use is very precise and very exact. And either you're saying a little bit of a conversion or you're saying half a convert. That's pretty intense. All right. And there's actually one of the more recent opinions, known as the Anacharoin, one of the later commentators, who he wants to, the way he philosophically categorizes this, according to the legalities. So it's a philosophical, legal terminology. And what he says is that the Ger Toshav is considered Jewish for his 7 commandments. No, he's not Jewish, and he does not have to do anything other than the 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach. But in those 7, he's not doing it like a Noachide, like a ben Noach, but rather he's doing it like a Jew. So he became, if you will, Jewish for those 7, which that's pretty intense. And of course, spiritually, that's very, very powerful and very empowering. Okay. Be that as it may, we keep stressing over and over again that so long as we don't have the Jubilee year in effect, Ger Toshav is unfortunately only theoretical, at least according to Maimonides, the Rambam. Now, there's a major difference, though, between a Ger Toshav and a regular Ben Noach. The regular Ben Noach is supposed to be accepting these 7, and if it comes to this, the Jews are supposed to, if they can, force him. That's the point. We said Yaakov, to compel or to force. So even if the person's not interested and they don't want to, if we have the power, we're supposed to force them. Whereas a Ger Toshav, that's surely not what he's doing. His whole point is he's doing it willingly, and he's accepting the oak of heaven, and then he's accepting the fulfillment of his commandments. But the good news is that, according to the Rambam, one can be considered Chasidei Umaysa Eilam. Not just a Noachite, but he can actually reach the level of being a pious or righteous of the nations of the world. And then according to the Rambam, that person has a share in the world to come, which means he's really not out of the picture, and he's not your regular person who's moral and decent and even keeps the 7 laws just because they make sense. Okay. Now, who is supposed to keep the 7 Noachide commandments? All of mankind. Okay, every human being. Even those that don't accept it in front of the Jewish court, and they don't become a Ger Toshav, but they still should accept upon themselves the acceptance of the commander, of the creator, of God Almighty, and that these are his divine commandments. That's the ideal way to do it, and that can be done nowadays. Not in front of a court necessarily. That's not the point. But for one to personally accept it. And this is, going back to the words of Maimonides, Moses, our teacher, has commanded us, the Jews, to compel the people to accept these commandments. And that's the connection to the giving of the Torah. Because the whole point of the revelation at Sinai and the giving of the Torah is for Jews to accept the yoke of heaven and then the yoke of the commandments. But that's not it. That's not all. Some people, and if I may say so, many Jews, sort of make a mistake. And the attitude, I'm not, don't misquote me, but the attitude of some is, I am a Jew, and I need to keep the commandments that God gave me, and I need to protect myself, shelter myself from the evil in the world, which is true, and from the nations of the world. And the less I interact or have to do with the non-Jewish world, with the nations of the world, the better off I am. And if I need to interact with them, it should be very minimal. I surely am not looking to influence them, proselytize, or anything like that. And the attitude often is, let them do what they want and be as they are, but just leave us alone. And they, for example, they even they quote or they misuse the verse that says that all the nations will go in the ways of their gods, and we're going to exclusively go in the way of Hashem. That verse is taken out of context when it's quoted in such a context. The truth is that the Jewish people have a mission, and that is to ultimately get the entire world to serve God, and that God should be totally revealed and accepted by all of mankind. And for example, a verse that is said very often in the prayers from Zechariah, that on that day, the day of the ultimate redemption, God will be Lemelech, he will be the king on the entire world. The entire world means all of mankind, means everybody. And the Jewish people have a responsibility to do what we can to bring us to that point. And that, of course, is aside for behaving properly myself and educating myself. There is such a thing that you have to educate yourself, first and foremost. And besides the fact that I'm supposed to affect and influence in a positive way all the Jews I can possibly reach, I have a responsibility to all of mankind that I can possibly reach. And then, of course, it makes sense that every person has responsibility to all the people they can reach. But the point is that it's a novel idea, in a sense, even though this is what Maimonides says, that a Jew is responsible for his non-Jewish neighbor, for his non-Jewish colleague. And I'm stressing this so much because this was not your given, this was not the average attitude until the Rebbe, Melech HaMashiach, expressed and explained it in great detail. Even though it's all clearly, strictly, openly based on the words of Maimonides. And it's not like anybody was disagreeing with Maimonides' approach. And it is due to the giving of the Torah that godly revelation, that the essence of God was revealed at Sinai, which empowered the Jewish people to be able to do this. And therefore, it's a completely new, different story from that moment of the revelation at Sinai. And from then on, no matter what was or wasn't beforehand, from then on, there becomes this obligation for all of mankind to keep the seven and for the Jew to take an active role in informing and leading the way and teaching, etc. And this is why Maimonides' choice of words is lakoif, to force. It has to be in a way, even to the extent of forcing them, meaning to accept the sovereignty of God with all of its details, and then to accept his decrees. That's the ideal way. Now, everything is so precise, so exact in Maimonides' writing. Where does he put these laws? In the laws of kings. Why in the laws of kings? Why not in the laws of conversion or some other place? I mean, he has the entire Torah, every single topic and subject matter. Why did he choose to put it in the laws of kings? And right before the laws of the ultimate Jewish king, King Mashiach. So the explanation to why the laws of kings is, since it's a matter of forcing people to accept the yoke of heaven, who has the power to do that? King. King can force the people. And ultimately, if you want to force the entire world, who can do that? That is going to be Melech HaMoshiach, the Messianic king. So it's no coincidence that Maimonides chose to put these laws of the 7 Noahide commandments in the laws of kings and right before the laws of King Mashiach. Okay, so we're going to, at this point, in the meantime, stop here and open up for questions and comments. And perhaps we're going to continue yet, because we still need to now deal with, practically speaking, what does forcing really mean? And the big issue, where was everybody for the past couple thousand years? Why did no one do it? And at least for the past 900 years since Maimonides wrote his ruling, why was basically nobody involved in doing it? But before we go on to that, let's open up for questions, comments, please.
Zoom user. Is that me? Yeah, it might be me because I don't know if I saved my name. I was going to say, why, if Israel's been reestablished, why haven't they reestablished the sabbatical year? I would have thought that would be something that would be done.
Good question. Good question. And the simple answer to that is, according to Maimonides, in order for the Jubilee year to go into effect, if that's what you meant.
That's right. That's my bad. Yeah, my bad. That's what I meant.
Right. You need to have all of the Jewish people, the entire Jewish nation, residing in the land of Israel. So, aside from the fact that I think it's still accurate to say that even today, less than half the Jews, it's pretty close, but less than half the Jewish population of the world reside in Israel. But even if it was 90%, it wouldn't be enough. So it's not that it's
citizenship.
Pardon?
What if you give all Jews automatic dual citizenship? Then they would all be residing there. Wouldn't that be a tack that you could get around that with? Automatic citizenship, as long as they go there once, or
no, that would be insufficient. And the truth is, I wasn't even going to go there because I was going to give you the simple answer. But this is a whole discussion unto itself, which I've alluded to a number of times, although I haven't addressed it as a full class. But the modern day state of Israel is a far cry from having Jewish sovereignty in the land. It's not just not religious. It's not a Jewish sovereignty because they are too scared and concerned with what everyone else is going to say. So there really isn't true independence. But that would be a whole lecture unto itself. And there are different opinions within.
I understand.
So it really, Yeah, the situation
It's not
today.
even a true Jewish state. It's not. It's more of a secular state that's somewhat Jewish, that was made by the nations as an appeasement after the terrible effects of World War II. So it was a bribe, really. And then they were able to successfully hold Israel with Hashem's help. And now things are coming together. But that's where the question comes in. The probability of being able to corral everybody there all at once permanently. Do they have to have a permanent residence, or can it be a temporary, like if everybody goes there, sets up a residence, or like puts a post address there? Like what level of conform do you have to have for this?
They have to actually have a permanent residence there and to actually live there. It doesn't mean that they can't leave the land, which is a separate discussion. Legally and technically, a Jew is not allowed to leave the land of Israel, but that's a whole discussion for Jews. How do we deal with that and what do we do? But a Jew is not allowed to leave the land of Israel. That's the straightforward, blanket, generic letter of the law. A Jew can't leave Israel, period. Unless, except, ... So we're,
We got to get slick with it.
Theoretically, it could happen that you get all the Jews to live in Israel, but according to the Rambam, that is really why we need Mashiach, so that we can have all the Jews back in Israel and the Holy Temple, and that we then are able to fulfill all the commandments, like the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year, etc.
Gershom.
Hello, Rabbi. I remember that you were discussing about Jewish laws, and I'm curious, like, are those applied today in modern Israel in some form?
What do you mean by Jewish laws?
I'm trying to remember, but I think it's like for the Jewish courts, the Jewish courts, I believe, or
I'm sorry, what did you say? Jewish what?
Jewish courts. I'm trying to remember. Yeah.
Okay. Again, basically, today's modern state of Israel doesn't change anything legally. What we were able to do in Israel 500 years ago, what we're obligated to do, applies as well today. They're really legally, by Jewish law, I mean, I don't mean legally in secular law. By Torah law, there's not much of a difference. So there are many, many laws that apply today as far as the produce of the land, the fruits, the vegetables, the grains that grow in the land, that a person cannot eat from them unless they're tithed, etc. Well, that applied 500 years ago as well. So and to have a Jewish court, we don't have one that's any more authoritative than outside of the land of Israel, or that we had, 500 years ago. So there's very little difference today. So yes, it's true that a Jew in Israel has many more commandments that he needs to and could observe and keep. So it's a responsibility, but that was always the case. Anyone else? All right. So the next part, page 140, we continue now emphasizing and stressing the importance and the obligation of the Jew, even nowadays, to get the non-Jews to accept and to keep their 7 commandments. And it's actually a direct continuation and obligation of the 613 that the Jew has to keep because of the Torah given. At the same time that God gave us the Torah, that's exactly what Mani is stressing. When he gave us the Torah, and he gave the Jewish people exclusively the Torah, and he commanded us to keep these commandments, at that time, at that location, through the same man, Moses, God gave the obligation to the Jewish people to get the entire world to keep and do their 7 commandments. So it's really part and parcel from the Jewish perspective. For the Jew, it's part and parcel of his requirements. In other words, I have to keep the Shabbos. You're not allowed to. I have to put on the tefillin, etc., etc., etc. I also am obligated to tell you and teach you and compel you to keep your 7. It goes together. It's not like it's a separate nice thing, or you should care about your fellow man, and since they need to do that, be nice. It's way beyond that. Now, how does one force? So as one of the more recent commentators that he says there's a concept called verbally forcing, and again, it doesn't mean verbal abuse, not abuse, but basically when you come with a very, very sincere, hearty, nice approach, and you're very convincing because you're so sincere and you really mean it, well then, that in a good way is very forceful. In our language, we don't usually use the word force in such a term. Whether you're taking force in the most literal sense, like in physics, that a force of energy or force is the way it would be used in a laboratory, or whether you're using it figuratively, that a person is forcing someone else to do something, such as blackmailing them or whatever. Usually in our language, the word force is an intense power or energy. However, it can be in a very, very pleasant way. So, for example, if a person is showering someone else with love and compassion and sincere care, well, you're forcing them to like you. Forcing, not a gunpoint. That's not going to really work. That would just work for instilling fear. You can't instill love by gunpoint. And, people should know that. If you're involved in any type of relationship, especially between spouses, the way to force love is by sincerely expressing your care for the other person for their sake. And human nature is such that you reciprocate. And sometimes it doesn't have to be anything said or even anything done, as we all have experienced at one point or another. There's just certain vibes that people give off. There's just a certain atmosphere. And therefore, that's one way that the Jewish people can force the nations of the world, is by attracting them to the 7 Noahide commandments in a very loving way. For example, the same word force is used in a metaphoric way in a midrash. The Talmud states that when God wanted to give the Torah to the Jewish people, so it says that kaffa, which is the word force, a mountain over them like a vat, like a what do you call it? A tub, like a vat, upside down, shape of a mountain, held it over them. And God asks the Jewish people, will you accept my Torah? If you do, wonderful. And if not, this and here and now will be your burial. And lo and behold, all the Jews accepted it very willingly. So the obvious question on that is, that's kind of forced upon us. And why do we make such a big deal that we say that the Jewish people accepted it and they did it willingly, etc., etc.? So the way it's explained in Chassidus is, metaphorically, what does that mean? He took a mountain, held it over them. It's that God revealed his greatness and his intensity and his deep, deep essence, intense love for the Jewish people that we couldn't resist. We couldn't say no because he was so loving to us. That's a form of force. Now, you don't have to have a king or even the Jewish courts. It's a personal obligation on every Jew. Yes, the Rambam, we said, put it in the laws of kings, and that would be the ideal way to get people to do it, when you have a king who can literally force them. But that does not mean that we are exempt. Even when we don't have a king, or at least not a king that everyone has as of yet accepted or recognized, and we don't have the Sanhedrin, the court that can force people to do things, especially in the land of Israel, or there's no capital punishment by Torah law, it still remains in the hands of every individual Jew that he has an obligation to reprimand, rebuke, help, correct, bring the 7 commandments to the awareness of the non-Jews that he can reach. And as a matter of fact, in footnote 66, we bring down from one of the sources that says as follows: if a Jew sees a non-Jew doing a sin, if he can rebuke him, if he's in a position to reprimand him, he should. See, one might say that the mitzvah, the commandment of rebuking, is only between a Jew and a Jew. Because after all, that is what the verse does seem to say when it speaks about it. This is one of the commandments, is that a Jew is obligated to rebuke his fellow Jew. Here it says that if he's able to, he needs to reprimand the non-Jew. And what's the proof? That Hashem sent Yoina to Nineveh. They weren't Jewish, and yet he sent him. So instead of learning that that was an exception, and that was something that was out of the ordinary, from that we should see, to the contrary, that any time a Jew has the ability to do so, he should. And then there's another, more recent codifier known as the Chassam Sofer, that he says that it's forbidden for a Jew to cause a non-Jew to do something wrong in their service to Hashem. And on the contrary, it is a mitzvah to teach them, to guide them. So now, at this point, we've established very, very clearly that if you have the opportunity, if you have a connection with a person, if a Jew, I'm saying, when I say you, I mean the Jew. If I have an opportunity, whether it's a business associate or whatever other interaction, especially if I'm in the position of influencing, whether I'm the employer or whatever the case is. So just like in business, each person is always trying to use out the other person, not cheat them, God forbid, but to use out the situation to make money. The buyer wants to make money and the seller wants to make money. And hopefully, in most cases, everybody walks away happy. I got the product, the item that I wanted. I got the money that I needed. I made a profit. You got your product. Great. So when it comes to business, everybody in general is thinking about themselves materially. So it's no different spiritually. If I have an opportunity to influence you, because either I'm the buyer or I'm the seller, and you need me, you want whatever, I should utilize that opportunity as a Jew to influence you about the 7 Noahide commandments, and not to say, don't mix religion with business. Yes, mix religion with business. Okay? Separation of religion and state?
I mix it all up. I pretend otherwise if needed. That's all.
All right. Now, repeat that, please.
No. There was somebody else that had a question.
Sorry. Go ahead. Yes.
Okay, this is Aaron. I have a question about. We were having a conversation, a group of Jewish people and myself, on a criminal justice symposium where we were talking about crime and punishment, and we were talking about murderers and people who do all kinds of things, and then we talked about the Rebbe, how he wrote a letter to someone and how he influenced Congress to establish this day. So I see the influence part that you're talking about there. But the thing is that I'm getting an unclear idea of how this is supposed to work if the Jewish person's requirement to influence. What happens after the influence has been done, and what happens if the Jew is not there to influence? The Noahide should be there to influence. Am I right or wrong?
What you're saying is logical, but I cannot say that there's such a law or a rule. In other words, Maimonides is speaking strictly to the Jew. So even when he talks about the 7 Noahide commandments in detail, he's teaching this to the Jew to know what to tell the Noahide. So
last week when we were talking, you would say it's preferable that a Jew does the teaching instead of a Noahide. So that's telling me that we shouldn't be doing that, because I'm looking at some things that are happening in the Noahide community where people are starting to develop their own forums and they're starting to communicate with each other. We've got guys out teaching the Kabbalah to Noahides. We've got people out here that are talking about taking back the rainbow flag and challenging the LGBTQ community. And I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's happening where you guys aren't involved. The Noahides are starting to make their own decisions about how they're going to proceed to tell other people about the Noahide laws. And my thing is that if there's not a Jewish rabbi involved, this is kind of a free-for-all, I'm thinking.
well, it's only natural if you have several billion people that are obligated to keep these laws, that they're going to be dealing with it within themselves. That's only human nature. But the question is, ideally, at the end of the day, when it comes to decision making, when there are doubts, so who's supposed to do it? So, of course, that would fall back on the sources in the Torah. So for that, they would have to ask the halachic, the Jewish legal experts. So whether that's this rabbi or that rabbi, whoever immersed themselves and became very knowledgeable and asked the leading rabbis of the generation and has all that information. That doesn't negate non-Jews learning about it and teaching it to each other. But the question is, when they want to make any policy or a major decision, they just have to make sure that it's all in line with the Torah law of the 7 commandments.
Well, the reason I'm saying is because the question came up is, do we entertain or do we even allow ourselves to communicate with people who do the wrong thing, and or what we think is the wrong thing? Let me say it like that. And we were talking about how the Rebbe was very accepting of people even when they did the wrong thing, and he was a loving, kind, warm individual who was pretty much non-judgmental in a way that he didn't say, okay, because you're this way, you can't come around us. He never did that. So when I'm seeing that Noahides are starting to develop exclusionary policies for people, then I see that they're not taking the same track that this kind, loving spirit that the Rebbe had, you know. But if someone does take that, they may wind up getting attacked because they say, oh, you're accepting this idea, you're accepting these types of people. And that's where the confusion comes in for me. I don't know if it's going to be a good thing for Noahides to develop these groups where they start to become hate mongers and stuff like that because of the 7 laws. I mean, if someone murders, do we say, okay, you need to be put to death? Does a Noahide have the right to say that?
Well, we don't. The Jew surely can't put him to death nowadays. And the question
the
is,
Noahide courts can.
what?
The Noahide courts can.
That is correct. But they would need to follow the ruling of the Torah that what is considered testimony, etc. But if they meet up to it, so fine. Now, if you're already mentioning the example from the Rebbe Melech HaMashiach, who's the one who is saying all this, etc., so to take his example, that to be completely accepting of the individual person, even before they do teshuvah, before they repent, to be completely unconditionally accepting the individual. The Jew is the Jew, or the Noahide as a human being. However, he very, very clearly negated and rejected publicly many philosophies or many approaches, and is very, very outspoken against it. So there's one thing you could say, we don't tolerate murder. But then does that mean that the serial killer should not be allowed into our forum? Maybe, maybe not. We have to be tolerant of the individual. We have to understand that the person has serious problems. We have to help them repent, as long as we're not putting anyone in danger. But not for a moment do we say, well, these are the 7 Noahide suggestions. No, they're laws. You must keep them. And we all have our Yetzer Hara, evil inclination, and we're not perfect. And some days are better than others. So we have our downfall. But I don't reject you as an individual person. But your misbehavior, as well as my misbehavior, I categorically have to reject that. Make sense?
The 7 known high suggestions. I like that one.
Yeah. So the point that we're going to address now.
Did you hear my question? I'm sorry, I was on mute.
No. So repeat.
What does that suggestion? What do those not suggestions? What does that look like? Are saying you if somebody's doing something wrong, what does it look like when we say you're doing wrong? And
I'll give you a couple of practical examples, even though they may not be very common, but they came my way over the years. A family member, a neighbor, a very close friend is going to be having a same gender marriage. Okay? God forbid, your brother, your sister, your best friend, your employer, your employee, someone who you're very much connected to is misguided, whatever, and they are having a wedding and they are marrying the same gender. How can you not go to your sibling's wedding What would you say to that? Should you go? Should you not go? Or somewhere in between? Or should you, what would you suggest?
As a Noahide who's followed the Rebbe for years, I would think I would go, because that is my family member, because it is a proper thing to do. It's showing that I don't have contempt for the person.
Okay, so I'm glad that we've used this example, and I very strongly disagree with you. Okay, I very strongly believe, based on things that I've studied, etc. And I have to be very careful because, I don't want to misquote people, and I want to surely not to say that the Rebbe Melech HaMashiach holds or says if I don't have it clear. I'm very careful about that. I am pretty certain that the Rebbe Melech HaMashiach would not approve of attending that wedding in any way, shape, or form. In other words, one might come up with a compromise and say, I won't go to the, whatever you call the ritual or whatever it is, the exchanging of vows or whatever, the actual ceremony. I'll come for the meal. I'll come for dessert. I'll show up for 5 minutes and just show them that I care for them, whatever. No. I think this is an extreme case. And my understanding is that in no way, shape, or form can I condone that so-called wedding, which means I cannot participate. If you remember, it was in the news a number of years ago. It was a big deal. I forget the details. I think it was either a bakery or a flower shop where they refused. And
It was a bakery. They got sued too. Yep. And they lost the case.
Yeah, very unfortunate. So I think that bakery was 100% right. And that is what one needs to do. And if it means that unfortunately one will be sued, well, it's easy for me to talk for someone else, but you cannot. If someone comes to me and orders a wedding cake, now, one can say, don't ask too many questions, just mind your own business. But if it comes to my attention that 2 men or 2 women are getting married to each other, I should say, same gender, I am not permitted to assist or partake or condone in any way, shape, or form, even though I'm just interested in making a living. I'm just getting paid for the cake. No. I cannot rent out the hall. I cannot be a musician. Nothing. Now, that's one side of the coin. The flip side is, how do I interact with that sibling or neighbor or business associate or best friend? I not only continue, but I show them extra special love and affection because I feel bad for them. And I do not cut off my ties with them. In other words, it has to be clear. I do not appreciate, approve in that institution. Personally, I'm accepting with open arms. So it's an extreme case, and that's, I think, the 2 sides to it. And that's just one example. Of course, these things come up all the time. So, for example, as a chassid, as a follower of the Rebbe Melech HaMashiach, I go to prisons to visit inmates, primarily the Jewish inmates. When I go there, I'm not judgmental. I don't have to tell myself, oh, the person's really innocent. Oh, the person was framed. Or the person did it, but they already repented. No. Of course, I should think that to give them the benefit of the doubt. But even if I know that they didn't, and the person did terrible things, I still care for them as a person, or in this case, as a Jew. And I still need to bring to them what their needs are. I mean, another example would be, and this is actually true, I'm sure, this probably happens, there's probably international laws about this, but when fighting a battle, I mean, it's happened when you have a terrorist, like in Israel, and they were stopped, but they weren't killed. Then you take that person to the hospital and you now try to save their life. It's at the time you do whatever you can to stop the terrorist from hurting people. But if you were able to stop by just hurting the person severely, you don't then leave them to die. You had to do what you had to do. Now what you have to do is take them, and it's very difficult on an emotional level to do that. And some people may disagree, but the point is you have to always know what's the right thing to do in the here and in the now. It's not just one extreme or the other. All right. Yes.
The guy got his hand up, but I'm going to let him go ahead and talk.
Good. Yes. Who's that?
Yeah, me, Rabbi Asher. Rabbi, somehow, somewhat related to the question. For example, there's family gatherings. Let's say Thanksgiving, and then they pray before eating the food, and they pray to another god. So, are you allowed to eat the food, or could you just say your own prayer and then also partake of the food? Or so, but beforehand they prayed for just
Okay.
to another god.
That's a good point. And really, there's no end to the technical questions that could come up. And in such a case, I'm going to answer it in general, not in particular. In general, I would say that it does not make the food inedible, non-kosher for the Noachide. However, you have to make it clear, at least for yourself, that you're praying to Hashem and to God alone. Now, being that it's not being held in a house of worship, but it's in a private home, and even though one person may be leading the prayers, which that's already a little bit of a difficult situation, because if you're going to be passive, it's a little bit of a problem. So you really would need to either step out or step up and say something. But otherwise, let's say that it's not that intense, and like everybody gets to say their piece, or everyone gets to say a thought or a prayer, especially like a Thanksgiving, so everyone gets to say something, and someone said something which is, idolatrous or whatever. So at the very least, you then take the opportunity and say what you're supposed to say. So it all depends.
Thank you, Rabbi.
A lot of details. And again, the issues can come up in countless cases when you get very practical. But that has to be the general approach. So we're up to page 141. Next week, as we said, we do not have a class scheduled. So we are scheduled to meet the following week after that. All right. Everyone be well. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Okay.
Have a good one.